Well, it's a wonderful question. Contested logistics is a term that we hear quite a lot now in national security communities. And I don't think that the community has a firm fixed definition for it. So, what I would volunteer that our definition for contested logistics is the access and placement of the adversaries of the United States government who leverage companies as their means of that access and placement. So if we think about it in terms of global trade, how it is that companies do business in the modern world, many of them are touching adversaries in the United States, specifically Russia, China, Iran, in most cases, and their proxies more often than they would choose to. Were those risks not really peaking today? But many companies are, for reasons that we can discuss, touching one or more of those adversaries in ways that allow them to be leveraged and allow their interests to be compromised in the process. And that's contested logistics, is how do you get your job done? How do you get your business to flourish in the context of what is really percolating as a global trade war? So, maritime choke points, we typically think classically about the canals. We think about Suez Canal connecting the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean and the Arab Sea to the Mediterranean and on to the Atlantic. And we think about the Panama Canal connecting the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean to the Pacific. Really, there are additional choke points that are emerging, and even the dynamics for those classical choke points are changing. One that has been emerging quite a bit lately is the al-Mandab Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. So we think about the effects of the Suez really being an open waterway that all countries in an age of peace and war should have access as being undercut by an Iranian proxy organization in Yemen that is firing upon civilian vessels. We can also think about that in the context of the nearby Straits of Hormuz, which is again classically thought of as a contested waterway. It's a very narrow strait bordering on the UAE and Iran, but really having an opportunity to block a number of OPEC countries from their global shipments of petrochemicals and energy. So we really just think about that as the initial set of really hot priming geopolitically contested waterways. The two that are really, really strong are very close together, and they're both threatened by Iran, which has made Bab el-Mandab and the Straits of Hormuz really a treacherous topic for global companies over the course of recent hostilities between Iran, Israel, and also the United States. At the moment, I would say that the suppression of the IRGC Quds Force ability to supply ammunition to Houthi rebels at Bab el-Mandab is actually a real positive goal of counter IRGC operations, and that it's a goal on behalf of global commerce, because that's a real threat, and it's been a threat that's been defining that major waterway even more than Suez has for many months now. What's really interesting, though, I would say about Panama is that it really is a largely American construct to think about it as an equally contested waterway. Panama is really critical for the United States to get its commerce and its military vessels from one ocean to another. And it's really the ability to deny the United States that access that makes Panama such a strategic choke point. There are others that are opening. It would be amiss not to mention the Arctic, even the Bering Straits. And of course, there is always the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea that make the waterways that are immediately adjacent to mainland China quite susceptible to geopolitics. I'm really interested in the Indian Ocean. for a couple of reasons. That if we draw a visual map for ourselves, extending farther away from Suez, farther south and east into the Indian Ocean from the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandab, which we just described, we get to a zone just south of India and Sri Lanka and Maldives that would seem like open ocean for days, but there's actually a relatively narrow compared to the whole ocean. It's still a pretty vast waterway between the southern end of the Maldives and the northern end of the British Indian Ocean territories. That is a place for what I think will become an increasing contest for blue water navies. We have seen a projection of force at a reconnaissance or exercise level from China into the Indian Ocean that far. We've seen a response by Europe and the Indian military itself to that projection. And we have US presence in the area. And I think that if there's a zone to really extend out the area of influence and the contest for who is able to control the strategic waterways around the Arabian Sea, it's going to be something that projects out farther east into the ocean in that zone. And if we go either further east still, we hit the Straits of Malacca and we hit the other waterways by mainland China that we discussed, South China Sea and Taiwan Straits. And if we come back through the Indian Ocean and look at what happens west of that waterway that is south of the Maldives, we have a diversion of two different channels for global trade, one that goes north into the Arab Sea or to the Persian Gulf, and the other that goes down south of Africa to get around the danger that has been created by the Houthis at the southern end of the Red Sea. And that diversion of two different channels, one of them being treacherous for violence and the other one being treacherous because of how expensive in time and fuel it is to divert a route that far south of Africa. There's a lot of decision making for companies right in this zone. And if you look at European, British, US influence on the southern end of that channel at the British Indian Ocean territories and a Chinese influence in Maldives and Sri Lanka, I think you have a contest percolating there, and that's where I would put more interest. Well, it's a wonderful question. And I think the first is to really keep an avid watch on the actions of governments that are aimed at shipping companies and at insurance companies. As we look at even a very different waterway and a different constraint, I did mention the Danish Straits, for example, which is quite essential to Russian commerce through St. Petersburg and East Luga. That there's been quite a lot of attention to constraining Russian trade and its energy economy as means of constraining Russia's ability to fund its war in Ukraine. So we look at governments really taking action against Russian companies and companies who do business with Russia. The whole world has to adjust. Not just because they need the energy exports, but also because you might be a shipping company who's trying to transport them. And this ripples out to lots of other industries. How does a provider in the UK who owns vessels of multiple types react to a policy change that is affecting one particular type of vessel? How does that provider react to being struck deliberately by Houthis because somewhere in a database, a ultimate beneficial owner is recorded as an Israeli citizen? So how do you really look and see how your company projects into the shipping ecosystem and understand where it will touch you, because there is no chance that it doesn't touch you? How can you plan ahead for where government policies are going? Perhaps there is an export you were relying upon that can no longer make its way reliably through a contested waterway. Maybe even there has been a climate shift that has caused a new waterway to open. Do you decide to use the Northern Sea route if you can, if it's going to potentially invite a Western government disincentive? How do you plan ahead for what governments are going to do? Happily, there are wonderful tools at your disposal to project these things. And I personally thinking this is a very serious and durable requirement for companies to have this kind of visibility. Uh, Recommend that tools like Babel Street, the Insight platform, are really the best way to do this kind of overwatch.